My ex spotted me at his company gala, smirked, and snapped at security, "Get her out. She doesn't belong here anymore." The flash drive felt heavier than 4 grams of plastic had any right to. I'd carried it in my clutch for 6 weeks. Through 3 meetings I hadn't been told were depositions and 2 dinners where Diane Ferris ordered the salmon and never touched it. Now it sat between my thumb and Marcus's stunned face like a stone I'd finally set down. He didn't reach for it. He couldn't. His hand was still wrapped around a champagne flute that wasn't shaking, but his voice was, when he finally found one. "That's stolen property," he said, too loud, the way people get loud when they're performing for a room that's already stopped listening. "Harrison, that drive was reported to security in April. She took it during the divorce. I have a police report." "You filed a report," Harrison said, "on a device you never described, for contents you never itemized, 3 days after your attorney learned Diane's office had opened an internal review of your division. I read that report this morning." So did Diane. Diane Ferris stepped out from behind Harrison's 3 trailing board members, like she'd been waiting in the wings the whole time, because she had. I hadn't clocked her in the crowd until then. Gray suit, flat heels, the kind of woman who dresses to be forgotten by everyone except the people she needs to remember her. General counsel doesn't wear anything memorable. It's part of the job. "Ms. Hale," she said to me, like the 2 of us hadn't spent 6 Tuesday nights under fluorescent light with the blinds pulled down. "If you're willing, I'd like to log that into evidence tonight, in front of witnesses, before this room decides what story it wants to tell itself." I was willing. I had been willing since the second Tuesday, when I first opened a folder labeled AS Vendor 2023 and felt my stomach drop through the floor of a conference room I wasn't even supposed to be in yet. "Celeste," Marcus said, and it came out strange. Half command, half plea. "Say something." Celeste didn't say anything. She was looking down at the champagne glass she'd dropped, at the dark stain spreading across $300 of imported marble, and for the first time all night, she looked like she understood the size of the room she was standing in. Harrison offered me his arm, an old-fashioned gesture from a 71-year-old man who still opened car doors, and I let him walk me past Marcus, past the guards who wouldn't meet my eyes now for a different reason, past Celeste and her ruined dress hem, toward a service hallway I'd been dragged down 12 minutes earlier like cargo. Behind us, the string quartet started again. Someone had told them to. Nobody had told them what song, so they played something generic and hopeful, which felt like the cruelest joke of the night. I want to be honest about something, because the version of this story that gets told at parties tends to skip it. I wasn't calm because I was strong. I was calm because I'd rehearsed this moment in my head for 5 weeks. In the shower, in traffic, at 2 in the morning with the ceiling fan ticking overhead, and by the time it actually happened, my body had already burned through the adrenaline on the rehearsals. What was left was something quieter, not peace, more like the flat, ringing silence after a gunshot. Harrison's office on the 14th floor still smelled like fresh carpet glue from a renovation 8 months earlier. Diane Ferris set the flash drive on his desk on top of a folded paper towel, put on a pair of blue nitrile gloves she produced from her clutch like she'd been carrying them all night, which it turned out she had, and photographed it from 4 angles with her phone before she ever touched it directly. "Chain of custody starts now," she said, mostly to herself, and wrote 9:52 p.m. on a legal pad, then my name, then hers, then Harrison's. "You carry gloves to a gala," I said. "I carry gloves everywhere," she said. "You'd be amazed how often it matters." Harrison sat on the edge of his desk instead of behind it, which I'd learned later was a habit. He did it whenever he wanted a conversation to feel less like an audience with the chairman and more like 2 people talking. "You should know the vote this afternoon wasn't contingent on that drive," he said. "The board decided on you 6 days ago, once Yusuf's preliminary numbers came in. Today's meeting was about the announcement timeline. The drive isn't what makes you CEO. It's what keeps this company from pretending none of this happened once you are." That distinction mattered more than he probably realized. I hadn't come back into this building to win. I'd come back to make it impossible for anyone to keep lying. 5 weeks earlier, on a Thursday in June, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize while I was standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store in a city Marcus didn't know I'd moved to. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Diane Ferris, General Counsel of Meridian Freight Group, and asked if I was the Rebecca Hale who had led strategy consulting on the Palisade Freight acquisition 4 years earlier. I hadn't used my consulting credentials since the divorce started eating my calendar. I'd signed an airtight non-disclosure agreement on that engagement, the kind that meant I never told Marcus which client I'd spent 11 months flying to twice a month, because the client happened to be his employer, and I didn't think it was anyone's business whose payroll validated my work. He used to ask what my consulting paid. He never once asked what it built. Diane didn't call about Palisade. She called because an accounts payable clerk named Renata Ibarra had flagged 2 duplicate-looking invoices from a vendor called Aldergate Supply Partners, both approved by the same VP of Operations, both routed through an expedited payment process that skipped the usual 3-signature threshold. Renata had done nothing dramatic. She'd just forwarded the invoices to Diane's office with a 2-line note. "These look off. not sure who to tell. That's the whole story of how something this size starts. Not a whistle, just a woman doing her job carefully enough to notice a pattern nobody wanted her to notice. Diane needed someone who understood Meridian's original vendor architecture from the Palisade integration, because whatever was wrong with these invoices was wrong in a way that only made sense against the framework I'd built. She'd pulled my old project files from the archive, found my name, found out, almost by accident, through a maiden name cross-reference in an old contractor database, that Rebecca Hale, the consultant, and Rebecca Vance, the VP of Operations, soon-to-be ex-wife, were the same person. "I need to be direct with you," she told me on that first call, standing in a parking lot with frozen peas melting in my other hand. "This may involve your ex-husband. I understand if that's a conflict you can't work through, but I also think you might be the only person who can look at these numbers and tell me in an afternoon what would take my forensic team 3 months to reconstruct from scratch." I said yes before I let myself think about it too long, because thinking about it too long was how I'd talked myself out of things for 9 years. The first Tuesday, Diane brought in Yusuf Rahman, a senior forensic auditor from Kessler and Voss with 16 years chasing numbers that didn't want to be found. He had the particular calm of a man who'd testified in enough courtrooms that nothing surprised him anymore, and a habit of tapping his pen twice before he said anything he considered important. "Here's what I know for certain," he said that first night, sliding a printout across the table. "Between March of last year and this May, Aldergate Supply Partners billed Meridian for freight handling services at rates roughly 40% above the market comparables I've pulled from 3 competitor contracts. Every invoice was approved by the same signature. Here's what I don't know yet, where the difference went." I looked at the vendor name and felt something click into place that I hadn't let myself think about in over a year. During the divorce, going through old files to find tax documents, I'd stumbled across a folder on Marcus's laptop, back when we still shared a home office, back when I still had the password because he was too lazy to change it after every fight, labeled simply AAS. Inside were spreadsheets I didn't understand at the time, invoice numbers that meant nothing to me, and one email thread with a subject line that had stuck in my head for no reason I could name: advisory retainer, keep separate. I'd forwarded the whole folder to my personal email at 1:14 a.m. on a Sunday, 11 months before the divorce was final, not because I suspected fraud. I didn't know what fraud looked like in a spreadsheet, but because some old instinct told me that a man who labeled things keep separate from his own wife was a man worth having a paper trail on. My Aunt Joan used to say it to me every time I doubted myself. "Write it down, Becca. Memories lie. Paper doesn't." She'd said it about grocery receipts and doctor's appointments her whole life, and somehow it had lodged itself so deep in me that I applied it to a marriage without even noticing I was doing it. I hadn't opened that folder again until Diane Ferris called me in a grocery store parking lot 4 years later. When I handed it to Yusuf on the second Tuesday, he read for 11 minutes without speaking, then looked up and said very quietly, "This is the other half of the ledger." The advisory retainer, it turned out, wasn't paid to Aldergate at all. It was paid to a limited liability company called Marsh Advisory Group, registered 14 months earlier in a state that didn't require you to name your officers publicly. Marsh, Celeste's last name. The company's registered agent address traced to a UPS mailbox 9 minutes from the apartment Marcus and I used to share, the one he kept, the one Celeste had since moved into. I told myself it could be nothing. People share last names with unrelated companies all the time. I told myself that for exactly as long as it took Yusuf to pull the public filing and find Celeste Marsh listed as sole managing member, effective the same month the inflated Aldergate invoices started. My hands were shaking by the time I got home that night. Not dramatic movie shaking, the small, stupid kind where you can't get your key into your own front door on the first 3 tries. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets for 40 minutes before I could make myself eat anything. The third Tuesday, I made Diane show me the math out loud because I didn't trust my own reading of it anymore. 14 months, roughly $24,000 a month in inflated billing, funneled through Aldergate, kicked back through a consulting fee to Marsh Advisory Group for vendor relationship strategy. That is roughly $24,000 a month in inflated billing, funneled through Aldergate, kicked back through a consulting fee to Marsh Advisory Group for vendor relationship strategy that, as far as anyone could determine, had never produced a single deliverable. Total, $340,000. "I need you to check this 3 more times before I believe it," I told Yusuf. "I already have," he said. "Twice with your files, once independently against Aldergate's own bank disclosures, which we obtained through a subpoena Diane filed under the company's internal audit authority. The numbers hold." I remember asking him this specifically, because it embarrassed me later how much I needed to hear it, whether it was possible I was seeing what I wanted to see, whether grief and anger could make a forensic accountant find fraud in a marriage that had simply ended badly. Yusuf tapped his pen twice. "Ms. Hale, I don't get paid to confirm what people want to be true. I get paid to be deposed later and defend every number I signed my name to. If this were thin, I'd have told you on day one and we would not still be meeting on Tuesdays," Diane insisted, over my protest that it was slowing everything down, on bringing in independent outside counsel from a firm that had never done a dollar of business with Meridian, specifically so that no one could later claim the investigation was steered by a jilted ex-wife with a grudge and a board seat waiting for her. It was the smartest thing anyone did in the whole process, and it was also the thing that almost cost us the window we needed, because word travels in a building like that, even when everyone swears it won't. On a Thursday in late July, a board member named Foster Whitcomb, 63, 22 years on Meridian's board, the kind of man who'd built his reputation on being the one who asked the uncomfortable question in every meeting, stood up during a closed session and said, in front of Harrison and 4 other directors, that he wanted the record to reflect his concern that Meridian was about to install a chief executive whose primary qualification this quarter is a personal vendetta dressed up as a compliance finding. Diane told me about it that same night because she thought I deserved to hear it from her instead of secondhand. I sat with it for a long time. Part of me wanted to be furious. A bigger part of me understood exactly why he'd said it, because if I were sitting in his chair, watching an outside consultant reappear 4 years later, holding evidence against her own ex-husband, right as she was about to take his job, I'd have asked the same question. Doubt isn't always malice. Sometimes it's just a person doing their job the way Renata Ibarra had done hers, carefully and out loud, even when it's inconvenient. What answered Whitcomb wasn't me. It was Yusuf's independently verified bank records and a second forensic opinion Diane commissioned from a firm in another state that had never heard my name before that week and came back with the same $340,000 figure to the dollar. Whitcomb didn't apologize to me directly. 2 weeks later, in a meeting I wasn't in the room for, he was the one who moved to make the board vote unanimous. I only heard about that afterward too from Harrison, who told it to me like a small gift, because he understood I'd needed the doubt answered by evidence and not by anyone's good opinion of me. Marcus tried his own version of a fix, in that gap between suspicion and proof. On the last Friday in July, a business blog with a readership of maybe 4,000 people ran an anonymous item claiming that a disgruntled former spouse with an axe to grind was pressuring Meridian's board into a hostile internal witch hunt against a top-performing executive. It didn't name me. It didn't have to. Anyone inside the building who read it knew exactly who it meant, and I found out about it from a text message from a former colleague I hadn't heard from in 2 years, who wanted to know, gently, if I was okay. Diane traced the item's language back to a private equity contact of Marcus's within a day, not through anything cinematic, just a comparison of phrasing against an email he'd sent a friend weeks earlier, the kind of sloppy consistency people fall into when they think no one is checking their words the way they check their numbers. She didn't sue anyone or issue a correction. She simply added the timeline to the file Ortiz was building, because attempting to discredit a witness while an internal investigation is active isn't spin. It's a pattern, and patterns are what convict people. I remember reading that blog post at my kitchen table with my stomach in my throat, certain for about 6 hours that it would work, that it would be enough to make Whitcomb's doubt catch fire in 3 other directors, that I'd spend the rest of this fighting a rumor instead of finishing an investigation. It didn't catch. Nobody on that board wanted to be the person who'd sided with an anonymous blog post over a forensic accountant's signed findings. But I didn't know that yet, on that Friday night, and the not knowing cost me a weekend I don't get back. The 4th Tuesday was the one where things stopped being quiet. Marcus wasn't a fool. Whatever else was true about him, he'd built a career out of reading a room fast enough to control it, and by early August, he'd clearly sensed something moving beneath the surface of his own department. He started arriving earlier than usual. He started asking his assistant pointed questions about who'd accessed certain shared drives. On the morning of August 9th, Meridian's IT security team flagged an anomaly. Someone had used Marcus's credentials at 6:41 a.m., before the building's security desk was staffed, to delete a cluster of files from a shared vendor management folder and empty the recycle bin behind them. IT recovered most of it within hours. Corporate systems back everything up in ways most people don't think about until it's too late for them. But the attempt itself mattered more than what he'd actually managed to destroy. Deleting records under active internal review isn't a gray area. It's obstruction, and it was the piece that finally moved this out of Diane's office and into a phone call to the Financial Crimes Unit of the City Police Department. Detective Raymond Ortiz had 14 years in financial crimes and the unhurried patience of a man who'd learned that fraud cases live or die on paperwork, not drama. He came to my apartment on a Saturday morning, not the office, because Diane thought, correctly, that I'd talk more freely somewhere that wasn't full of glass walls and other people's ears. He had a leather folder instead of a laptop, and he wrote everything by hand in small, careful print. "Walk me through the folder you forwarded to yourself," he he said. Every detail you remember. Don't smooth it over. Don't guess at anything you're not sure of. I'd rather have 3 true things than 10 I have to throw out later. I told him about the keep separate email. I told him the truth, which was less dramatic than he probably wanted. I hadn't understood what I was looking at back then. I'd saved it on instinct, the way you save a receipt for something you can't return yet, but might need proof of someday. That instinct, Ortiz said, closing his folder, is going to be worth more in a courtroom than almost anything else in this case. Juries don't trust people who claim they knew everything from the start. They trust people who say exactly what you just said to me. He asked for the original files, not copies, so his department could run its own chain of custody parallel to Diane's. He asked whether I'd be willing to testify if it came to that, and told me plainly that it might take a year, sometimes 2, for a case like this to reach a courtroom, and that I should prepare myself for a slow ending even though everything else about the last month had moved fast. I told him I understood. I did not, at the time, fully understand. Nobody understands slow until they're living inside it. The deadline arrived the way deadlines always do in this kind of story. Not as one clean moment, but as a Sunday that kept getting worse by the hour. Meridian's quarterly earnings call was scheduled for Monday at 9 a.m., and buried inside the same press cycle, the board intended to announce my appointment as chief executive, effective immediately. Diane had explained the stakes to me flatly, over coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier. Once the market opened Monday and the announcement went out, the company would be a public entity with a new CEO and an unresolved internal fraud matter involving a sitting VP. If law enforcement hadn't formally taken possession of the evidence and opened a case file by then, Meridian's own disclosure obligations got complicated fast, the kind of complicated that invites shareholder lawsuits and SEC inquiries into what the board knew and when. We have until midnight, Diane said. After that, either this is a criminal matter with a case number, or it's an internal HR issue we quietly settle and hope nobody ever asks us why. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table I realized around 2 a.m., where I used to sit and rewrite Marcus's certification study notes into flashcards 9 years ago, back when I thought helping him build something meant I was building something too. My phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. It was Yusuf. Marsh Advisory Group initiated a wire transfer 40 minutes ago, he said. $210,000, moving out of the account and into something offshore. Ortiz's team caught it because the bank flagged it against an active subpoena. They're working with the bank right now to freeze it before it clears. My chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with metaphor. I remember pressing my hand flat against the table to stop it from shaking, the same way I used to press it flat against the steering wheel on nights I drove home from that apartment, wondering if I was imagining all of it. Can they stop it? I asked. I don't know yet, Yusuf said. I'll call you the second I do. I sat with that uncertainty for 51 minutes. I know the number because I watched it on the microwave clock the entire time, the way you watch a pot you've been told not to watch. I made tea I didn't drink. I reread the same paragraph of Yusuf's report 4 times without absorbing a word of it. At one point, I caught myself rehearsing, out loud, in an empty kitchen, what I'd say to Diane in the morning if this fell apart. Some version of I did everything I could, which is the sentence you prepare when part of you has already decided you failed. I hated that I had that sentence ready. I made myself put it away. At 12:38 a.m., Ortiz called me directly, which he hadn't done before, which told me before he said a single word that something had broken loose. We got it, he said. Bank froze the transfer at 12:04. That's evidence of intent to conceal now, on top of everything else. I want you to know, that call your accountant made, catching it in real time, that's the difference between a fraud case and a fraud plus flight risk case. Judges take that seriously. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exhausted in a way sleep hadn't touched in weeks, and underneath that, something colder. The understanding that Celeste hadn't just been a woman in a red dress lifting a glass at me. She'd been moving money at midnight to keep it out of reach. Whatever she and Marcus had built together, it wasn't love that made her do that at 11:07 on a Sunday night. It was math. Monday came anyway, the way Mondays do, regardless of how little sleep you've had. At 7:02 a.m., and before the earnings call, before the press release, before any of the language the company's communications team had spent all weekend drafting, Detective Ortiz and 2 members of the Financial Crimes Unit arrived at Meridian's 14th floor offices with a search warrant covering Marcus's office, his company laptop, and the shared servers tied to the Aldergate account. Diane met them at the elevator with a copy of the internal audit and Meridian's full cooperation on file, because a company that fights a warrant looks like a company with something to hide, and Diane had spent 18 years making sure Meridian never looked like that. I wasn't in the building yet when it happened. Harrison had asked me to wait, and for once I listened to someone telling me to wait, because I understood this part wasn't mine to stand in the middle of. What I got instead was a call from Diane at 7:41, her voice steadier than I felt. He's being escorted out now, she said. Not by us, by Detective Ortiz's team, under the warrant. HR terminated his employment for cause 40 minutes ago, effective before the police arrived, so there's no ambiguity about who fired him and why. I asked, because some petty, human part of me needed to know whether it was the same security guard from the gala. Devin, Diane man said, and I could hear something like a small, unwilling smile in it. He asked to be reassigned to a different floor for the day, said he didn't think he could do his job with a straight face. Marcus was arraigned 11 days later on charges of embezzlement, wire fraud, and obstruction of a corporate investigation. Celeste was charged separately, conspiracy and money laundering, tied to Marsh Advisory Group. And the two of them, according to people who still talk to me out of some mix of guilt and curiosity, stopped speaking to each other somewhere around the second week, once their lawyers explained that anything they said to each other could no longer be protected the way it once was. The Praxis Business Journal ran the story under a business reporter named Priya Chandra, who called me for comment and, when I declined, wrote the piece using only the board's official statement and the public court filing, which was, I came to learn, exactly the kind of restraint that separates a serious outlet from a gossip mill. The headline wasn't cruel, it was just true. Meridian Freight names, new CEO amid fraud charges against former executive. Sometimes the truth doesn't need embellishing to do damage. It just needs to be printed. People who had laughed at the gala found other things to do with their mouths after that. I didn't gloat about it, mostly because I didn't have the energy to. Watching your ex-husband's name attached to felony charges isn't satisfying the way movies promise it will be. It's just heavy, in a different direction than the marriage was heavy, and you carry it anyway because there's no version of setting it down that doesn't also mean setting down the fact that you spent 9 years loving someone capable of this. I walked into Meridian's offices for the first time as chief executive on a Wednesday morning in September, 3 weeks after the raid. I didn't take Marcus's old office. I asked facilities to give me the smaller one down the hall instead. I told them it had better light, which was true, but the real reason was that I didn't want my first months in that job spent in a room still shaped like someone else's ambition. Renata Ibarra, the accounts payable clerk who'd flagged 2 duplicate invoices without knowing what she was starting, still works in the same department. I asked to meet her personally, my second week, mostly to say thank you in a way that wasn't a press release. She seemed surprised anyone remembered her name. I told her the whole thing started with her, and that most companies never find out about the fraud sitting inside them because most companies don't have a Renata paying close enough attention on a Tuesday afternoon to notice 2 invoices that looked almost, but not quite, the same. 6 months after the gala, Marcus took a plea deal rather than face trial, restitution, a felony conviction, and a sentence his lawyer negotiated down to 18 months, a fraction of what the maximum would have allowed. Celeste's case is still moving through the courts as I write this. Ortiz tells me these things take longer than anyone wants them to, and I've stopped expecting a single dramatic gavel to make the whole thing feel finished. What I have instead is smaller and stranger than justice in the movies. A company that reported record retention rates its next 2 quarters, not because of anything I did personally, but because people trust a place more when they've watched it choose to expose its own rot instead of hiding it. A board that stopped whispering my name like a controversy and started using it in front of clients. A young guard named Devin who, 6 months later, still can't quite look me in the eye in the elevator, and probably never fully will, and I've decided I don't need him to. And a flash drive, the one Marcus swore for a year I'd stolen, sitting now in an evidence locker downtown with a case number instead of an accusation attached to it. There's a version of this story that ends with me standing over him, the way he stood over me at that gala, saying something sharp enough to quote later. I used to think that was the ending I wanted. It isn't the one I got, and I've made peace with that being better. The last time I saw Marcus in person was through a courtroom gallery, 3 rows back, the day he entered his plea. He didn't look for me in the crowd. I don't think he expected me to come, and I almost didn't. I went because Ortiz had told me gently that some part of finishing this would only happen if I let myself watch it end, instead of just hearing about it secondhand. He was right. I drove home after and slept 11 hours, the first full night's sleep I'd had since June. Harrison retires in the spring, and the board has already started talking, half joking and half not, about who trains under me the way I once trained, quietly on someone else's org chart, for a job nobody told me I was auditioning for. I think about Renata sometimes, still flagging invoices 2 floors down, still doing the unglamorous work that nobody claps for until 18 months later, when it turns out to have mattered more than anything said in a boardroom. I think about my Aunt Joan, who never met Marcus, who died 5 months before that email landed in my inbox with the subject line, "Moving Forward," and who would have found this entire story, I suspect, both vindicating and completely unsurprising. He built his whole version of me out of what I paid for and what I forgave. I built mine in the end out of 6 Tuesdays, a woman with nitrile gloves in her clutch, and a habit my aunt taught me before I ever needed it. Write it down. Memories lie. Paper doesn't.